Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragon's Jewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan. And I'm just going to get all those wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so. It's just down below. And if you like the content, please make sure you're hitting the like button on the videos, and of course, if you want to share some love down in the comments below, it's always greatly appreciated, and I absolutely love reading them. I do my best to make sure that I respond back and share some love in your direction as well, because naturally, without you, this channel wouldn't exist, and I appreciate each and every one of you. And I thought I would bring some of those Halloween spooky vibes to the channel. There are going to be in the WIP and Chat style format, but I'm going to read some ghost stories of Alberta, which is the province that I reside in. So I will have a spooky canvas that I'll be working on, and then I'm going to read a couple of ghost stories so that you can listen along while you dab and paint, or work on another craft, or what you normally do during WIP and Chats kind of thing, and I keep you company with some spooky tales from my province. So I figured that would be fun. The Empress Theatre. The Empress Theatre in Fort Macleod is the oldest functioning theatre in Western Canada. It has a proud and colourful past. It also has a ghost. Construction of the theatre began in 1910. This milestone was noted this way in the January 20th edition of the Lethbridge Daily Herald. Macleod is to have a new opera house. In every particular except size, it'll not be as surpassed by any in the province. There will be every modern accessory of a first-class theatre. It'll be a great addition to the appearance of the town's chief thoroughfare. 2 years later, Main Street's new crown jewel was completed. As its opening, the Empress became the fourth theatre in the little town of Macleod. Over time, the other three playhouses have become history, leaving the Empress as Fort Macleod's only theatre. The Historical Society, responsible for maintaining the place today, explains, the Empress Theatre has always played an important role in the community. It has served as a vaudeville house, a concert hall, and a lecture hall, as well as having served as a venue for live entertainment. In its most recent incarnation, it has become a movie house. Given the cast of characters that have entertained their way across the Empress's stage, it's not surprising that there have been a few psychic imprints left behind. After all, what self-respecting Albertan in 1935 would have thought of missing a performance by Texas Tony and his Wonder Horse baby doll, accompanied by the Purple Sage Riders? Surely folks must have traveled from far around to witness such an entertainment event. More recently, the place hosted a sold-out crowd after booking Sarah McLachlan for a performance. Both of these performers and many others left their comments on the downstairs graffiti wall. Some members of Sarah McLachlan's crew also left with stories to tell their grandchildren. Two of the roadies were standing on the stage after a performance when they heard footsteps go by them. Later, when their work was done and they were relaxing over a celebratory bottle of beer, they heard scratching noises at the door. Despite their careful investigations, no source was ever found for the sounds. These two normally pragmatic meat and potato guys also watched a blind in the theatre being snapped back and forth when there was no one near it. A few years ago, the ghost at the Empress Theatre managed to pull off an expensive prank. He was apparently responsible for a banging sound emanating from the hot water pipes.
because the theater's administrators had no idea the sounds were being mystically produced. They went to all the trouble and expense of having the offending pipes removed. Unfortunately, even though it is now physically impossible, the sounds of pipes banging persisted. Some parts of the auditorium were more haunted than others, actor Bruce Watson described feeling a cold spot at the front of the house. He also reported that last summer I had a strange feeling someone was standing over my left shoulder down the backstage staircase. I mean, I literally felt like there was someone there. The man's report is in keeping with other accounts, for it is in the same spot that many people report feeling a presence, and where an actor reported seeing an apparition while he was on stage. In another sighting, a former employee saw the ghost too. In both cases, the viewer described a man with big hairy arms wearing a brown shirt. Although he didn't have time to note the entity's appearance, Mike Ford, an employee of the society that operates the theater, remembers not only the time the ghost ran past him, but also hearing the phantom when he thought he was alone in the concession booth. A little girl once had an experience that she's not likely to ever forget. She went into the basement washroom, and while standing at the sink, glanced up at the mirror. There, staring at her, was a man's face hanging suspended a little above her eye level. When the child whirled around to confront the intruder, she saw that she was in fact alone in the washroom. Being the solitary occupant didn't console her enough to allow for lingering. The child ran to her mother, who then reported the incident to the theater's staff. There was little they could do except to chalk up another sighting of their ghost. All the sightings have resulted in amazingly similar descriptions of the apparition. There is great debate as to who the ghost might be. Some think it's the spirit of the longtime owner and manager, Dan Boyle, who bought the place in 1937. Others, like Diana Segbor of the Empress Theatre Society, think the ghost is Ed, a former caretaker. Either assumption is reasonable. Dan owned the theater for many years. He was responsible for many of the functional and decorative upgrades that grace the theater today. While Dan Boyle having devoted as much of his life to the place, it wouldn't be surprising to think that he decided to oversee the theater into eternity. Ed, the former maintenance man, is an equally convincing candidate. So convincing, in fact, the Empress employee Bonnie Hismel readily admits she greets the ghost with a cheery "Hi, Ed," as she enters the place every morning. Ed was apparently very devoted to his job, but he was also devoted to his considerably more profitable sideline, bootlegging. It was that part-time occupation that eventually led to Ed's demise. He was found murdered, his body unceremoniously left on the grounds of the auction market. No one was ever brought to justice for the lethal act. Because the ghost's presence in the Empress is often accompanied by phantom smells of liquor and tobacco, Diana thinks it's Ed's spirit. Whoever he is, Dan or Ed, the ghost of the Empress is likely emotionally attached to the place. During a particularly unsettling time in the theater's recent history, staff members heard crying coming from somewhere in the empty building. The ghost seems to pick up on bad vibrations, they agreed. And he certainly doesn't want to be forgotten. As Diana explained, I've heard him walking in the theater and the alarm goes off lots too. He's also tapped on the projection booth window. Another employee was pushed down some stairs by the force of an invisible hand between her shoulder blades. That incident was unusual, for most frequently, the specter seems to want to stay out of the way. When people are upstairs, they generally hear him going about his ghostly affairs downstairs. When people are downstairs, he's often heard on the balcony. One day, as Diana entered the building, accompanied by another woman, she called out a greeting to the presents, and the two women went about their business. Joyce was humming a tune. She recalled, when she stopped, Ed whistled its ending. Some of the spirit's pranks can be quite unnerving to theater staff as they try to clean up after a performance. They know the ghost is about because they can hear him walking, but that's not the worst of it. Sometimes when you're sweeping up, you can pick up the same wrapper 4 times, explained one staff member. The seats in the theater are spring-loaded to fold up out of the way when they're not occupied. Sometimes Ed or Dan will put on quite a show for the people closing up. They watch in amazement at the seats go up and down, seemingly of their own accord. The spirit is not a shy one. While he has often been active when the theater is full, on these occasions he has usually preferred to communicate with someone who is alone in a room. Despite the apparent preference, the entity has occasionally shown off to a group of people. A group gathered around drinking coffee watched in collective amazement as a coffee cup moved around a table, seemingly of its own accord. Thinking that either the bottom of the cup or the surface of the table was wet, someone picked it up to wipe any such friction-reducing moisture away. The tactic might actually have worked, except that both the cup and the table were dry. When put back down, the cup moved again. During some recent renovations, there was a layer of sawdust on the floor. A group of people clearly heard footsteps, but did not see anyone, nor were there any footprints left behind in the sawdust. Occasionally, too, something at the Empress will prohibit the employees from opening the safe. The combination that worked well the day before will every so often just not open the vault. The last time the locking mechanism was thrown out of kilter, Bonnie lost her patience and really told the ghost off. Since then, there hasn't been a problem. Perhaps the spirit realized that his particular action was especially annoying to the present-day staff. He may crave attention, but like most of us, he doesn't enjoy being in trouble. Former Empress Theatre employee Trent Morose noted that the feeling of the presence had been especially strong after showing certain films. He said that sometimes when he was locking up, he could feel a cold breath from the theater itself. Only a thoroughly haunted building could invoke such a description. Perhaps future job ads will include a caution discouraging easily spooked potential employees. Granny MacKay's place. Jacqueline Calmers knew she was taking on an enormous number of responsibilities when she began the work necessary to create a restaurant from a long-abandoned homestead near Millavar, south of Calgary. An unforeseen obligation, however, did take her completely by surprise. Jacqueline had no idea she would be responsible for contributing to a long-deceased lady's sense of happiness and contentment. I always felt an energy in this place, that it needed laughter and life, Jacqueline continued. Since my family and I have moved in here, the ghost must be happy. It's a very active home, and aside from one instance when we first moved in, there's been no more ghostly activity. That certainly wasn't the case when Jacqueline first took over the old MacKay homestead and opened her pioneer-style restaurant. While the creation of the dining room imbued the place with some laughter and life, it wasn't consistent energy, Jacqueline realizes now. Vibrancy of any sort had been non-existent at the MacKay family home for many years before Jacqueline bought it. Built in 1895, the house had been the home to the MacKay family from 1916 until 1972, when Agnes MacKay, the last of the descendants to live in the house, died. After his death, the home sat empty for nearly 20 years. until the entrepreneurial Jacqueline began reclaiming this one small piece of central Alberta's history. Shortly after taking over, Jacqueline commented that the first tentative explorations into the house were like opening a time capsule. It was like time stood still. She not only found clothes still hanging in closets, but even food in the cupboards. To someone with different plans, this ditchersis might have been an inconvenience. But for Jacqueline, every article she found was part of the area's heritage, a valuable artifact to be carefully restored and preserved. The only concessions she was willing to make to modern times were the kitchen and washroom facilities that she needed to add. Not long after taking possession of the homestead, Jacqueline opened the restaurant, which she respectfully named the MacKay Place. Word of the special new restaurant in the historic setting spread. People began making a special point to visit Millerville and to enjoy lunch in the ambiance Jacqueline had painstakingly recreated. Not all of her guests, however, left at closing time. There was evidence right from the start that someone else wanted to have a hand in running the new business. We had a clock on the windowsill in the kitchen. It was just a $10 clock. I won't say it was ugly, but it certainly was bright and colorful. One morning I came in and the clock was on the floor. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. I just presumed it had fallen, so I picked it up and put it back on the sill. The next morning, it was on the floor again, but this time both the hands were off the clock. I picked it up, fixed the hands, and put it back on the windowsill. The next morning, the clock was on the floor again, and again, both the hands were off, but this time only one of the hands was lying on the floor. To this day, no one's ever found the other hand for the clock, and Jacqueline now believes that the spirit in the home just doesn't like that particular clock. I think she thought it was too contemporary for the older style of the home. The broken clock proved to be just the first of the ghost's attention-getting stunts. I had a dozen silk roses in an old enamel coffee pot. When I came in one day, they were gone. I thought, darn, they've been stolen. This disappearance was puzzling because she wasn't sure the bouquet had been there when she locked up the night before. Later, when she found 6 of the missing roses outside, Jackie was relieved. Her relief turned to further concern when she discovered 5 more roses in the cupboard. While it was reasonable to think that a would-be thief might have suddenly suffered a pang of conscience and dropped the flowers on the way out, there was no way that anyone would have access to that cupboard. More puzzling still was the whereabouts of the last missing silk flower. I've looked everywhere, she acknowledged, but I've never found the 12th rose. While the incidents with the clock and roses were puzzling, they didn't really upset anyone. Those experiences were still to come. Jacqueline recalled receiving a frantic phone call from her staff at closing time one evening. They were terrified, having heard a gruff voice in a stairway that they presumed was empty. She was rushed over to a restaurant and searched the entire premises. Jacqueline found nothing, though she couldn't help but notice a heavy, oppressive atmosphere about the place. The next morning, that feeling was gone entirely. Another time we had dinner guests. One of the women was a clairvoyant. She left her chair to use the washroom, which was located down a narrow hall. As she walked, she felt a cold draft up her dress. The woman was so unnerved by the experience that she went directly back to her place at the table without ever using the washroom. Jacqueline feels that an experience that she herself had shortly after the cold draft episode was related to it. I was working in my office because we added on to the back of the place. The window in the room no longer looks outside. It's now an interior window. I was alone and really concentrating on my work when I became aware of a dark figure passing the office window. I looked up, but no one was there. I had locked myself in, but still, I checked around because I felt like there was someone there. I think it was the same being that caused the cold draft in the hallway. Guests enjoying a meal on what was the time an outside veranda noticed a rhythmic creaking throughout much of their meal. Finally tiring of the sound, the mother asked her little boy if he was turning the rungs on his chair with his feet. The child attested that he was not, and the creaking continued. This time, a longtime neighbor offered the probable explanation. Miss MacKay used to like to spend the early part of her evenings rocking in her rocking chair on the veranda. The haunted MacKay Place restaurant has since become not only a bed and breakfast, but also the Chalmers family home. Although the spirit makes us aware, as Jacqueline acknowledges, this latest incarnation of her former home seems to please long-deceased Miss MacKay, for the entire group now lives happily in harmony. Who could she be? La Boheme restaurant. One day early in the spring of '95, I was waiting for a friend to join me for an annual luncheon celebration. It's become traditional to hold this early ritual at La Boheme, a restaurant in a charming old building in the Highlands area of Edmonton. I arrived a bit earlier than our planned meeting time, so Ernest Eder, the restaurateur, showed me to a quiet table and offered me a cup of coffee while I waited. The lunch crowd hadn't arrived yet, and I decided to take advantage of what I knew would only be a temporary lull. As Ernest poured my coffee, I mustered up what I hoped was a casual-sounding voice and said, "This building's really old, isn't it? Would you happen to know if it might be haunted?" The words were no sooner out of my mouth when the lid of the sugar dish at my table lifted off its base and set itself down on the table, a good centimeter or more away from the bowl. I was grateful that Ernest was still standing beside me, and so had also seen the strange movement. At least I knew that if I was seeing things, I wasn't alone in what I was seeing, and we both realized that my question had been an answer on his behalf by the spirit herself. After exchanging incredulous looks, followed by a somewhat unnerved smile, we continued our attempt at conversation. "Oh yes," Ernest confirmed. "Somewhat unnecessarily now. She usually only comes out late at night, though, after closing." As Ernest made that comment, the restaurant's hungry lunchtime crowd, my friend along with them, began to arrive, effectively ending my opportunity to probe further for the story. I replaced the lid on the sugar bowl and went on to have a pleasant lunch. I put the incident at La Boheme pretty much out of my mind until a local librarians association asked me to do a reading at one of their meetings. "We're holding the meeting at La Boheme," the contact person advised me. I would have been delighted to accept the invitation, no matter where the gathering was to be held, but I was even more pleased to have an opportunity to follow up on the unfinished ghost hunting business from several months before. It was a cold winter's night, and Ernest Eder's warm greeting in the foyer of the restaurant was most welcome. As he hung up my coat, I decided that in order to avoid another missed opportunity, I'd better launch into my questions and my reasons for them as quickly as I could. I introduced myself and reminded him of the incident with the sugar bowl lid. "Would you be willing to share the story of La Boheme's ghost with me for my next book?" I asked. After only a moment's hesitation, he kindly agreed. The building, officially known as the Gibbard Block, was constructed in 1913 as a luxury apartment building. The spirit likely lived or worked in the building during its early days. She is a distinctly benign spirit who rarely makes herself felt while the restaurant is open. When the staff's closing up at night, though, they can sometimes hear her and feel her presence. Other than that, she stays in the basement. For this reason, the staff suspects the phantom may have been a laundress for one of the original families who lived in the apartment building. Over the years, a few staff members have told Ernest that they feel uneasy if they're alone in the restaurant late at night. Some have gone so far as to ask that they not be scheduled to lock up. The restaurateur has always been happy to comply with those requests. Despite his apparent understanding of the occasional staff member's unease, it's clear that Ernest Eder enjoys Le Boheme just as much as its resident spirit does. The Ghost Takes a Bath. Not long ago, I was invited to Lethbridge to do some readings and interviews. Everyone was always so welcoming wherever I went in the city that when a camera operator for the Renew New House show began chatting with me before the program, I wasn't surprised. Seconds before I was on the go, the woman gave me her phone number on a slip of paper along with this cryptic message. "Call me. I have a story I think you'll like." Well, I finally made that call, and I'm certainly glad that I did. Despite the number of provocative ghost stories I've heard over the years, a few really stand out as being especially eerie. Jean Van Cleek's story is one of those. In 1976, Jean was supporting herself as a musician. "I sang and played the guitar and keyboard," she explained. Constant travel is an accepted part of such a life, and so the young woman was well accustomed to staying in motels and hotels around the province. It was usually midnight by the time I got to my room. I had a habit of always putting the extra latch on when I locked the door at night. During a week's stay in Tabor, however, Jean had a little trouble with the extra locking mechanism. When I woke up the first morning, the latch was off the door. I was very annoyed with myself. I could hardly believe that I had forgotten to lock it. By the end of her stay in Tabor, she knew the lack of security couldn't be blamed on her absent-mindedness. It turned out that the lock problem was only the first event in what was to be an unforgettable week. The next night when I got into my room, I was doubly cautious to lock the door, latch and all. Before I went to bed, I checked again, and so I knew for sure that the latch was on. When I woke up in the morning, it was off again. The only thing I could figure was that for some reason I'd gotten up in the middle of the night and unlatched it. This was really an odd thought to me because I'd never sleepwalked before in my life. The third night in the room, Jean again dutifully locked herself in, but rather than go right to bed, she decided to stay up and watch some television. "That's when I heard it," she said quietly. "Water swishing in the bathtub. That's a very distinctive sound. Not one you'd confuse with anything else. And it was clearly coming from the bathroom adjoining my room." Momentarily frozen in horror, Jean soon realized she would have no choice but to go into the bathroom, confront whoever was in there, and explain as calmly as possible that he or she had gotten into the wrong hotel room. "I knew it was going to be embarrassing," she recalled, "but I also knew it had to be done." I screwed up my courage, walked into the bathroom, and looked over at the tub. I couldn't believe my eyes. The bathtub was completely empty. There was no one in the room and no water in the tub. The irony then was that Jean was more concerned by the fact that the bathroom was empty than she had been when she was sure someone was in there. She knew that she'd heard and where it had come from, even though there was no apparent explanation for the noises. Showing amazing calmness, Jean turned in a little later and slept soundly through the night. The next morning all was quiet, but once again the security latch had been taken off the door. Jean's contract to provide the musical entertainment for the hotel's lounge specified that she had to stay another 3 nights. Every night at the same time I heard the sounds of swishing water coming from the bathtub, and every morning the latch was off the door, she stated. Then she added, "When I checked out, the desk clerk seemed a bit surprised. He said something like, 'They gave that room?' I said yes, and I asked why that would surprise him. He told me, 'It's just that we don't usually rent that room. A guy died in there a while ago. He had a heart attack while he was taking a bath.'" Now at least Jean had an explanation for the strange events she'd been witness to over the past week. I asked whether or not she'd been frightened by her encounter, and she replied, it wasn't really a bad feeling, it was just a there feeling. Jean's hunch that I enjoyed hearing her eerie anecdote was certainly accurate. Few stories have chilled me quite as effectively as hers did. Banff Springs Hotel Update. In June 1995, I was invited to attend a reception at the Banff Springs Hotel to celebrate the launching of an hour-long television special documenting some of the haunted places in Western Canada. The party was held in a suite of rooms just off the elegant Rob Roy dining room. This location hadn't been chosen at random. It was that, over the years, many hotel employees had reported seeing an apparition of a bride dancing a solitary waltz. The image is widely believed to be the ghost of a bride who died there on her wedding day. She was making her entrance down a spiral staircase when the train of her bridal gown brushed up against the candles used to light the stairs. The young woman panicked and fell to the bottom of the stairs, where she died instantly, her neck broken. Shortly after her death, the staircase was bricked up. The result was a stairway that went up a dozen stairs before ending abruptly at a solid brick wall. A strange sight indeed. When I heard that work crews were tearing down the brick wall, I was curious as to whether the renovation might provoke some additional ghostly activity. Hoping to allow time for an encounter to occur, I let a couple of months go before calling the hotel with my inquiry. The hotel's public relations department was delighted to report that the demolition had revealed a fabulous stone floor, of which they hadn't been aware, but that was pretty much all. To date, there had been no further sightings of the slightly transparent dancing bride. To my knowledge, no one in our group of celebrants saw the long-deceased bride either, but the location of our gathering certainly did provoke some additional stories. A young woman serving at the party informed me that one particular elevator in the hotel will always return to the 9th floor. That's where Sam MacKay, a former bellboy at the hotel, was rumored to have hidden his tips. MacKay is still seen helping out around the hotel occasionally, although he's been dead for nearly 50 years. The ghost stories about the bride and the bellboy are well known, but the story Lethbridge resident Mike Prokop told me an incident at the luxurious hotel was one I'd never heard before. Mike and his friend Robert William were driving back home after a trip to the West Coast. They had intended to make it as far as Calgary before stopping for the night, but bad weather forced them to cut short the day's drive at Banff. It was raining too hard to drive. It was late, about 11 p.m. by the time we arrived in Banff. We tried all the hotels we could find, but they were all booked, so we went to the big hotel. Considering that they were not looking for the luxurious accommodations that the Banff Springs Hotel provides, just overnight shelter for the inclement weather, Mike reported that they found the hotel a bit pricey, but we just couldn't make it to Calgary. We had something to eat and a beer and then went to our room. I have a habit when I'm staying in a hotel of leaving the bathroom light on and the bathroom door ajar, so that if I wake up in the middle of the night, I know where I am. The two weary travelers fell asleep almost immediately, the light from the bathroom casting a reassuring glow over them. In the middle of the night, Mike was awakened by the sound of the toilet in their room flushing. "Is that you, Bob?" he called out. "No," his friend replied. "I'm right here. The maid went in there. I saw her go in." As soon as the man heard himself say those words, he knew that what he thought he'd seen couldn't possibly have happened. Both men jumped up and checked the door to their room. It was still as they'd left it when they retired, locked with the security chain in place. They were dumbfounded. Bob had been awake when he'd seen the image walk into the bathroom. Both men had heard the toilet flush, but there was no one there. No one that they could see anyway. Neither man slept much after that. We only stayed long enough to have a bit of breakfast the next morning, and then we were on our way, my informant admitted. To this day, both men are convinced that their sleep on that rainy night was disturbed by a ghost who was totally unaware of their presence in her room. The Cronquist House. Red Deer's Cronquist House owes its continued existence to a group of hard-working, concerned citizens. Unfortunately, one of their first acts in securing preservation annoyed the ghost in the huge home. The house has been moved, explained Elizabeth Plumtree, executive director of the society that now runs the house. We think that's why he's mad. He is presumed to be the ghost of Elias Cronquist, an elderly man when he died in the house in 1973. Elias had lived in the house virtually all his life. His parents had brought him and his 3 siblings to Alberta from their native Sweden in 1911, whereupon, according to Elizabeth Plumtree, they built this big, splendid home. Of the 4 Cronquist children, only 1 married. Another was killed in the war. Elias and 1 other sibling lived on in the family home. I understand he was quite eccentric by the end. He was alone in this huge 4-story house, but he only lived in 1 room. He died a bachelor. There were no heirs to the estate, and the house sat empty for years after the old man's death in 1976. When the Alberta economy was booming, the land on which the Cronquist house sat was purchased by a developer. The company intended to cash in on the migration of families to the newly prosperous province by building a subdivision full of new housing. The developer had no use for the old run-down mansion that sat in the middle of its real estate acquisition and was going to demolish it just to get it out of the way. At the time, the Red Deer Cultural Heritage Society had just decided that it needed a place to establish headquarters. A deal was struck between the 2 disparate outfits. The developer was spared the expense of tearing the deteriorated place down by donating the house to the society, which in turn would acquire a much-needed home base. Elizabeth Plumtree explained that the people of Red Deer rallied around the project with heartwarming enthusiasm. While the society raised funds to help support the mammoth project of moving the enormous house, other members of the community were also at work. People and companies donated time, expertise, labor, and equipment to help make moving the Cronquist house and preserving it a reality. Unfortunately, poor old Elias was apparently not a man who took to change easily. Even today, more than 20 years after the fact, he's still objecting to the relocation. We'll come into the house in the morning and the doors will be swinging madly. The house is operated as a tea house now, and occasionally table settings, cups, and saucers will be totally moved. Doors will slam when there's no one near them, Elizabeth recounted calmly. She quite enjoys the presence, though. It enhances the fabric of life, I think. When a new employee started work there recently, he was greeted by a loud crash. Elizabeth tried to reassure the startled man by crediting Elias with having made the racket. Others have reported that their backs become cold all over, a sure sign that a spirit is just behind you. Next time you're in Red Deer, drop in at the Cronquist house and enjoy a light lunch. Don't worry if your table setting is moved around. That'll just be Elias joining you for the meal.